Will a two-state solution bring peace to the Middle East? Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome again, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thank you for listening, and thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with biblical prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You will find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thank you for your prayers and support for this ongoing faith ministry. On today's program, Dr. Schnitger interviews Carol Rushton regarding her brand new book entitled Understanding Israel and the Middle East. This book is subtitled Myths, Misconception, and the Truth About Israel and Her Neighbors. In this 25-chapter book, Carol deals with many of the lies and anti-Israel propaganda that we hear so often in the Western media. Carol lived in Israel for 8 years while working for the Jerusalem Post. She also studied the Middle East and Bible prophecy for most of her life. All of this knowledge and experience is included in this very timely book released on the 70th anniversary of the modern state of Israel. So let's join Dr. Schnitger and Carol Rushton for today's informative message.
Thank you, Dane, and welcome, friends. This is an exciting time at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. By the grace of God, we have just published our third book entitled Understanding Israel and the Middle East. The book is subtitled Myths, Misconceptions, and the Truth About Israel and Her Neighbors. This book has 25 chapters and is 175 pages long. And what an appropriate time to be publishing a book such as this, as we are celebrating this year, 2018, Israel's 70th birthday as a modern nation. I believe that this is the signal miracle of the 20th century, and the event which is not only the fulfillment of several Bible prophecies, but also the event that starts the countdown clock to the second coming of Christ. And what a privilege we have to have in studio today the author of the book, Carol Rushton. Carol, it's great to have you back in studio today.
Well, it is absolutely great to be here, and I'm so excited to be back so we can talk about the book.
Well, it's been a real joy working with you and publishing the book, and we were able to get it published just in time for the second annual Blessed Hope Prophecy Forum in Norman, Oklahoma, sponsored by our great friends at Prophecy Watchers, and it was a joy sharing this information to those who attended our seminar during this 3-day event. And several of the books have already been sold and in circulation. And we're excited to be able to share this material with our listening friends. So we have a couple of questions today, trying to stump Carol, which is very difficult to do, but we have a couple of questions that we'd like to discuss in today's podcast. Last week, we were talking about some of the land for peace issues that Arabs have put forward in the past. And as we discussed last time, Israel has been very generous in giving land to their Arab neighbors, but hasn't exactly resulted in peace to this point. But we want to start by talking about what's called the two-state solution. And this is a concept that has been talked about and pushed by the Arabs for decades. And so the question is, the $64,000 question is, will a two-state solution bring peace in the Middle East? What we're talking about is a separate Palestinian state, separate from and equal to the state of Israel. That's what the two-state solution is. And Carol, do you believe that this two-state solution will bring peace in the Middle East?
Well, again, we have to go back and look at a little history to be able to answer that question. The short answer is no, but I think people need to have a little bit of a historical background so they'll understand the answer to the question. Now, under the Balfour Declaration, the Jews were originally supposed to get a really large chunk of land. They were supposed to get not only their ancient homeland of Israel, they were also supposed to get part of Jordan. And so that was going to make for a huge chunk of land for Israel.
What year was the Balfour Declaration?
1917.
1917. So we've been waiting 101 years
Yes.
for the terms of the Balfour Declaration to be realized.
Right. And in the 1920s, England decided, nah, I don't think we really want to do that. And of course, they had some considerations as well. You have modern warfare. You have you didn't really have too many horses, because that's how the cavalry would fight, horses and your ground troops. Well, you have, with the advent of the 20th century, you started getting into things like cars and motor vehicles, which developed tanks. And then you had the Wright brothers and their development of the airplanes. And so then you had, in World War I, you had, those little bitty airplanes that were going around that Germany and the Allies and the Great Britain and France would have. And so you had the advent of modern air warfare. So, and what do all these things need? Well, they need oil. They need petroleum. Who is providing a lot of that petroleum? Well, Great Britain didn't have a whole lot, and France didn't have a whole lot, and Europe didn't have a whole lot. Who had the resources to provide oil and petroleum to run these various vehicles? Well, it was the Arabs, the Arab states. And so they were providing Great Britain and other allied and European countries with oil so they could develop it into petroleum. Well, so they had practical considerations. They did not want to antagonize the source of their oil, which you have the modern advent of electricity too. So you had all of these different factors coming into play. So Great Britain had to make some pretty tough choices, and while we understand that, they really reneged on their promise to the Jews under the Balfour Declaration. They said, we really can't afford to antagonize the Arabs, so we're going to give the Jews a little bitty piece of land, and so they can come. And they also restricted Israeli immigration too in the 1920s and 30s, because they didn't want to antagonize the Arabs. Well, the Arabs, some of them were very peaceful, and it didn't bother them that Jews were coming back to their ancient homeland, but it did bother some, and there were riots throughout this 20-year period when Jews were coming actively back into their ancient homelands to reclaim them. There were Arab uprisings. There were Arabs would massacre Jews. So you had various things like that going on in this about 25-year period that was called the British Mandate period. And the Great Britain put out a series of white papers as to why they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. Well, after World War II, the world was very sympathetic toward the Jews because they found out about the Holocaust. They found out about the Nazi death camps and the gas chambers. So there was a lot of world sympathy towards the Jewish people and towards the Jews having an ancient homeland, so that a place of refuge that they could go to so that they would not be persecuted, a place that they could live as Jews and not have to worry about, somebody's going to come in the night and burn down our house, or we're not going to be, the government's going to come and put us in a death camp. Mm-hmm. So the United Nations came up with a plan which they called the two-state solution. And Israel would have a tiny little bit, but I think Arabs got most of the land, to be honest with you. And they did that. I think they came up with that the formal plan, and it was voted on in November 1947. Well, Israel, and during this time when the UN was proposing this two-state solution, the Jews weren't actually really thrilled with that, but they came to the conclusion that a small country was better than none. And this was the best deal that they could get at the time. So even though it wasn't ideal and they weren't going to get what they really wanted, they were willing to accept it based on the fact that it was better than nothing, which before all those years, I mean, for almost 2,000 years, they'd had nothing. The Arabs refused to accept the UN partition plan, and it was called the UN partition plan. They refused to accept it, and there were riots, and basically even before Israel declared itself a state on May 14, 1948, there were already skirmishes and little battles taking place between Jews and Arabs. So when Israel declared itself a state in 1948, the Arabs said, well, we don't have to worry about this. Israel has nothing. We have all this military equipment and all these forces. Hey, we're going to go ahead and wipe out this Jewish state in a few days. Everything will be good.
So despite the fact that the United Nations passed this partition plan and Israel had agreed to that, despite all of these official and diplomatic things taking place, you're saying that Israel's Arab neighbors went ahead and declared war and invaded Israel anyway.
Yeah, and they were very open and honest about it. They said if the Jews declare Israel as a state, well, we're going to go in and we're going to attack these Jews and we're going to wipe them off the face of the earth, and there's not going to be a state of Israel. And they attacked them within, I think, about 24 hours or less. So Israel, they were already having fights and battles and skirmishes anyway, so they knew what to expect. And Israel had nothing to fight with, basically. And it's just a miracle that they were able to at least come to a standstill, because the Arabs were forced to say, well, okay, we'll sign an armistice or a truce. It wasn't an acknowledgement of Israel as a state, but they signed a temporary.
And they didn't.
Truce.
At the armistice, the Arab neighbors did not sign on to a two-state solution at that point either.
No, down through the years, you had 1956. You had Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, which he was actually a dictator, and in 1956 he seized the Suez Canal from Great Britain. Of course, Great Britain and Israel weren't very happy with that, so they planned to attack Egypt, and so again you have, and of course Egypt was. They weren't very happy with Israel, and so they didn't accept Israel as a country. All throughout the 1960s, I believe it was 1964, the Arab states actually established the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, to carry out attacks against Israel. And this is one of the things that they used to commit terrorist attacks against Israel and kill Jews. They're very, very open about it. And they made many, many statements, which are documented in the book, quotes from Arab leaders throughout the years saying that they would never accept Israel. They would never accept the Jews in the Middle East. In 1967, you had the Six-Day War. Again, you had Arabs, countries surrounding Israel and threatening to attack Israel. Israel really had no choice but to commit itself to a preemptive attack so they wouldn't be overrun by Arab forces. Again, the Arab countries refused to recognize Israel.
Would it be safe to say that the Arabs support the one-state solution?
Yes, I mean they have really all through these years, and they talk about the two-state solution. They talk about this, they talk about that, and they push this two-state solution. But in reality, they don't really want a two-state solution, because they could have had a two-state solution in 1947, 1948 if they'd really wanted a two-state solution. They could have had.
So these Palestinian refugee camps could have been disbanded long ago. And these so-called displaced people could have had their own nation
yes.
if they wanted that. to happen.
They really wanted that to happen.
Yes.
And you have the peace treaty in the 1970s between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. That didn't really bring peace to Israel. You had the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. We all know that hasn't worked out very well. And then you have a couple of Israeli prime ministers, Ehud Barak in the 1990s and then Ehud Olmert in the 2000s. They both tried to reach a peace agreement with Yasser Arafat and the PLO for a two-state solution, a Palestinian, a Arab state or Palestinian state next to Israel. And under both Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, these different prime ministers, they gave Arafat and the Arabs about 99% of what they wanted. Even Ehud Olmert actually agreed to a land bridge so that people in the Gaza Strip could go over to Jordan or to the west, to Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, and vice versa. That would have split Israel in two, which would have been national suicide for Israel, because then you have all these terrorists going back and forth. They'd never be able to defend themselves.
Right in the middle of Israel.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and you had that, and Ehud Olmert agreed to have at least 5,000 of these Arab refugees that had fled Israel to come back. So they got about 9, and they were going to split Jerusalem, and part of Jerusalem was going to be for a capital for this new Arab state, and they gave them a lot of what they wanted, and they were going to give most of Judea and Samaria back. They got about 99% of what they wanted. And Yasser Arafat continually, both times, never accepted a deal, turned them down. So the Arabs really don't want a two-state solution. They really want a one-state solution, and that's an Arab state all the way from Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And the maps of these countries will show you quite plainly that there's no Israel on those maps. Jerusalem is Al-Quds. All the Israeli names have Arab names for their cities and towns. There's no Israel there on those maps.
That's the one-state solution.
And that's the one-state solution as far as the
no
Arabs.
Israel, no Jews equals peace in the Middle East.
Yes.
That's the one-state solution.
Yes, that's the one-state solution. You hear this term thrown around, a just and lasting peace. Now, when we think about a just and lasting peace, we think about Israel existing along with her neighbors, having diplomatic relations with all of her, and economic ties and development with all of her neighbors. And if there are any differences, Israel will work those out at the diplomatic table with her neighbors. So there's no war, like civilized people do.
Right, like the United States and Canada, for example.
Right. With
real borders and real diplomatic relations and trade and all of those nice things that Westerners think of when they think of just and lasting peace.
Yes. Now, what the Arabs will never tell you is that when they think of a just and lasting peace, their idea of a just and lasting peace is a Middle East with no Israel, no Jews, and their maps prove it.
Similar to Hitler's view of the just and lasting peace, the final solution, no Jews in Europe.
Right.
That's peace.
Yeah, as far as they're concerned, that's what they view as peace. Now, Arabs know that these little buzzwords and phrases, they've learned those quite well, because they know the right buttons to push to get Westerners to accept some of the things that they say. But Westerners just they're so trusting, and they just don't realize that the Arabs are manipulating them. They don't really mean what they say.
Well, I'd like to talk briefly about a recent event that is capturing news media in recent weeks, and get your take on it, and that is the recent murder of a Western journalist, Khashoggi, who was murdered in Turkey. And it's a hot topic right now, and everyone has a different perspective as to who's responsible. Is it the Saudi government? What's going on? But it doesn't seem to be a story that's going away. So what is your perspective on the recent Khashoggi murder that took place in Turkey?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that basically, I think what Turkey has accused the Saudis of is probably basically true. it looks like there's abundance of evidence that Khashoggi went into the embassy, the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey, was murdered there, was dismembered. They took his body parts out in all these different bags, and that looks like that's probably what happened. And the facts seem to bear this out, especially because before they were any people were allowed to go into the embassy to get evidence to see what was going on. The Saudis sent in a cleaning crew. Yeah, I mean, come on.
Okay.
I mean, come on. And
so he didn't just slip on a piece of ice.
No.
Apparently.
No.
He got iced, but it was,
yes.
Yes, we
in
might
a very
say
bad
that.
way.
Yes.
And I'm sure that probably the Saudi government, I would say, ordered his elimination, probably at the highest levels. However, number one, the Saudis have been doing these types of things for years. The Saudis have a very brutal regime. You can't commit adultery. A woman can't commit adultery. I mean, she'll be.
That's a capital offense.
That's a capital offense. She'll be murdered. I mean, they'll execute her. If you steal something, you get your hand cut off. If you're raped, you have to have 4 witnesses. If a woman is raped, and of course she usually gets pregnant, well, from these rapes, if she's gained rape, she has to have 4 witnesses to say that she did not entice anybody to rape her. Well, in these Muslim countries, there's nobody going to stand up for the woman. They're going to believe.
So women's rights really don't exist for Saudi women.
No. I mean, they now have, after all these years, they now have the right to drive. And they're trying, I think they might have the right to vote. I think that came across pretty recently, too. But the Saudis have been doing these kinds of things for years. And now all of a sudden everybody's outraged. Come on. So, but however, Turkey's trying to set itself up as a paragon of virtue as far as human rights, and they're trying to paint themselves as, we really care about this journalist. We really care about that Saudi Arabia. Please. Turkey has one of the worst human rights records in the world. According to the United States State Department, they published a report earlier this year in the spring on the human rights record of Turkey in 1917. Turkey has arrested tens of thousands of Turkish citizens without charges or on trumped-up charges. They are tortured in detention. They are put into prison. Some of them disappear, and they're never heard from again. We just recently got a pastor out who had been languishing in a Turkish prison for 2 years on the trumped-up charges that he was involved in terrorism in Turkey. How ludicrous and ridiculous is that?
And I think this terrorist pastor actually visited the White House when he returned, and he got down on his knees and prayed for President Trump. I mean, this man is a hardened terrorist.
Yeah, you don't see many terrorists praying like that.
So, in other words, Turkey does not have a sterling human rights record in terms of, for example, the treatment of Christians, treatment of pastors, probably the treatment of journalists who are critical of the Turkish regime.
Oh, you can't. Yeah, Erdogan, who is basically the dictator. He's supposed to be the president or prime minister, and he's basically been operating under martial law for the last 2 years. And so
how convenient.
Yes, he's ruling with a pretty iron fist.
Yes.
So Turkey is not exactly.
So why is Turkey making a big deal of something that they do all the time as a matter of course? Why are they blowing this up against Saudi Arabia? What do you think they want to accomplish?
Well, first of all, the Turkey has aligned itself with Iran, which is pretty radical. President Erdogan is a very radical Islamist, and so is Iran. The mullahs in Iran. So Turkey has aligned itself with Iran. And
but Saudi is a Muslim country. Why aren't they all buddies?
Well, the Iranians are Shiites, and the Saudis are Sunnis, and you get into things like, well, who accepts, so and so as far as the right person that will carry on the Islamic relations and the religion, and so the Shiites only accept, I think, one of, was it Muhammad's son-in-laws or son or something like that, and the Sunnis accept a variety of descendants.
So these religious differences go back 1,400 years or so.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's what it stems from. So this might seem kind of silly to Western ears, but it's very serious, very, very serious. Also, the Saudis have had, down through the years, a fairly good relationship in spite of their not so sterling human rights record as far as treatment of women and other people. I mean, you can't even bring a Bible into Saudi Arabia, even as a tourist. So they've had a pretty good relationship with Europe. They've had a pretty good relationship with the United States. So
how about Israel? Are they getting along with Israel, Saudi?
Well, as far as Saudi Arabia and Israel are concerned, I think the Saudis are pretty pragmatic. You know, they don't like Israel. They don't like Jews. I guarantee you. I mean, I've heard all this stuff about how wonderful it is that the Saudis are being more open to Israel. Come on. The Saudis are pretty pragmatic. I can tell you that right now in Saudi schools in Saudi Arabia, they're still teaching their children that Jews are descendants of apes and pigs. So let's not kid ourselves about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is looking at Iran. Iran wants to have nuclear weapons. They want to send these nuclear weapons over to the United States, destroy the United States. They want to send these nuclear weapons into Israel and destroy Israel. Well, that's going to affect Saudi Arabia. And also you have the Houthis who have taken over Yemen, which Yemen is on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis are proxies of Iran. So basically, Iran
So they have Iran at the border through
Yes.
the proxy
Yes.
Houthis in Yemen.
Right.
So the conflict is getting very close to the Saudi border.
Yeah, they're it's really coming home. So, and the Houthis will periodically shoot rockets into Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has to go into Yemen and bomb the country. So all of these things make Saudi Arabia very nervous. And they're looking at Iran, and they're looking at Israel. Everybody knows that Israel has nuclear weapons and has never used them. They're looking at Iran and going, well, we don't especially like Israel, but the people in Iran, they're crazy. And so
In other words, if they get nuclear weapons, they will use them.
They will use them. And so they're looking at this, and they're taking a very pragmatic view. And they're thinking, well, if we have to align ourselves with somebody and get some help somewhere, it's better for us to just, hold our nose, try to get along with Israel a little bit better, because we know that Israel, it doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia is going to have diplomatic relations with Israel. It doesn't mean that Israel and Saudi Arabia are going to be buddy-buddy. But there have been lots of things going on behind the scenes, and if Israel decided to take out some nuclear facilities in Iran, I think the Saudis would help them simply because they've got a pretty good deal going in Saudi Arabia, and they don't want to spoil it, So
would I be correct in saying, in sum, that your view is that the inflation of the Khashoggi murder by the Turkish regime is meant to score propaganda points against the Saudi Arabian administration?
Yeah, anything that they can do to weaken Saudi Arabia and strengthen their own hand, and of course strengthen Iran's hand, because you have all of these different factions and all these different puzzle pieces in the Middle East, and you have all of these things going on, and you have to really be discerning about what's going on really behind the scenes and why the Turkey is doing what they're doing. So they're not great lovers of Saudi Arabia. So anything that they can do to weaken the Saudi government, they're all for. I can tell you that if a journalist had walked into the Iranian embassy, our consulate in Turkey, and the Iranian did the same thing to this person, to another person, as the Saudi government did to the Khashoggi, I can tell you right now, Turkey would cover for Iran. They would defend Iran. They would help with the cover-up, and they would give any reason or explanation, no matter how ridiculous or improbable it would sound to our ears, to defend Iran if this same thing happened in an Iranian embassy in Turkey. So I think Westerners need to not fool themselves about what's really going on. Yes, what happened to Khashoggi was terrible. Nobody should ever walk into an embassy and be dismembered, right. Especially while they're alive.
Right.
And, I mean, this was a terrible thing, so let's not kid ourselves. But, as far as Turkey throwing this big hissy fit, come on. This is like the pot calling the kettle black.
Well, I think this Khashoggi incident does highlight for us how we as Westerners tend to think in different ways than Middle Eastern people. We tend to think of the white hat people and the black hat people, and that everything is, you're in one camp or the other. But really, when you're dealing with Middle Eastern dictators, perhaps there are no white hats. And as Westerners, we just need to have a realism about that, and to recognize that there are schisms and historic rifts and animosities between these Middle Eastern administrations, and that has an effect on the propaganda coming out of the Middle East that's, of course, being amplified by the Western press also. So in other words, this is purposeful. The inflation of this story into the headlines in what is really a pretty common feature of Middle Eastern life, that there must be some reason strategically for Turkey to inflate this issue as it relates to the press value, the propaganda value against Saudi Arabia.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah, so we really do need to be discerning. And going back to your book, that's really the purpose of this whole book, is to help Westerners who think quite differently from those who live in the Middle East or have lived in the Middle East, as Carol has, in terms of really understanding the propaganda points that are propagated pretty uniformly by the Western press against Israel. And so we're going to continue our discussion in future weeks. We've only begun to scratch the surface in our discussion with Carol about her brand new book, Understanding Israel and the Middle East. And friends, I'm sure that you're going to want to obtain a copy, perhaps multiple copies, for your family and friends, and possibly even your pastor. And now our announcer, Dane Rome, will share how you may obtain a copy of this informative new book.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitker. Today, we're offering the latest book published by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. The book is entitled Understanding Israel and the Middle East by Carol Rushton. The concluding chapter of the book is written by Dr. Schnitker and deals with God's peace plan for the Middle East. This professionally published book has 25 chapters and is 175 pages in length. You may obtain a copy of the Understanding Israel and Middle East for a gift of $9.99 plus $2 for shipping and handling. To obtain your copy, go to our website, www.swpm.us. Go to our bookstore and type in Understanding Israel and the Middle East. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Well, friends, please join us again for next week's Last Days Beacon program, brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Until then, this is your announcer, Dane Rome, saying thanks for listening.